to welcome you all to our 6th Dean's Lecture for 2017 and the last for this year. Tonight really is special. It's the 5th biennial Fritz Duras Lecture, hosted in partnership with the Australian Council for Health, Physical Education and Recreation Victoria, known as ASPA, and it coincides with the ASPA conference, which starts tomorrow. Our speaker tonight is Professor Anne Flintoff from Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Anne has endured a very long flight to be with us, and despite the jet lag that she assures me she is not feeling, she's kindly agreed to present what is a very important lecture to our graduate school, to ACFA members and to the wider community. I'd like to thank the ACFA Victorian President, Trevor Robertson, and Chief Executive Officer of ACFA Victorian Branch, Hilary Shelton, for attending tonight's lecture. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who have been and are custodians of these lands. I acknowledge that the land on which we meet was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands and of this university. So, first of all, I'd like to warmly welcome Fritz Duras's children, Peter and Michael, and Peter's wife Sue, and their son Tony, Michael's wife Sandra, and their daughter Annette. I'm delighted that you could all join us tonight. Before I introduce our presenter for the evening, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Fritz Duras Lecture. As part of our Dean's Lecture series, we are commemorating and continue the significant contribution of Dr. Fritz Duras in the areas of health and physical education. Fritz, who is pictured here in this really beautiful portrait, was a renowned member of the education faculty here at the University of Melbourne. His move from Germany in 1937 was facilitated by Professor G.S. Brown, who was then Dean of the Faculty of Education, with the aim of establishing a course to train physical education teachers. Fritz, who was a medical doctor and specialised in sports medicine, was appointed Director of Physical Education. He established the first Australian university course in physical education. He was a pioneer in the field. In fact, his life was a series of firsts. He was also the first Vice President of the Australian Sports Medicine Federation, the first President of the Australian Physical Education Association, the first Australian to be elected to the American Academy of Physical Education, and the first President of the International Council for Physical Education and Sport. So tonight, we celebrate his legacy with an address from another innovator of physical education, Professor Anne Flintoff. A former PE teacher, Anne now holds a research and enterprise lead of physical education at the Carnegie School of Sport at Leeds Beckett University. After her teaching career, Anne was awarded an Economic and Social Research Council studentship to complete her Masters in Physical Education at the University of Leeds, and shortly after that was appointed to Leeds Beckett University, where she has held posts for over 20 years as Senior Lecturer, Principal Lecturer, Reader, and the Associate Dean Research for the Carnegie School of Sport. Anne's major work is with PE students and addressing equality issues in their teacher training. Her interests with equality led to her completing a PhD at the Open University in the area of gender relations. She lectures in Sociology of Physical Education and Sport on the Leeds Beckett University's MA Physical Education course and supervises a number of doctoral research programs whose research focus was on equality and difference within PE. She's been the lead author on numerous publications delving into themes of whiteness, anti-racism and sexuality, and has supervised 10 PhD students. Anne has recently completed a 2-year project in collaboration with Professor Fiona Dowling from the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences in Oslo, which used PE as a specific subject lens to examine white teachers' perspectives on race and racism. This research, funded by the British Academy, created new knowledge about racialisation, embodiment and schooling. It also examined official ideas about race within national curricular policy. It's our pleasure to have Professor Flintoff present tonight's lecture on diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in health and physical education. I've asked Professor Christopher Hickey, Chair of Academic Board at Deakin University, to move a vote of thanks at the conclusion of this lecture. Christopher is an ACFA Fellow and has known Anne professionally for many years, and I really am delighted that he's agreed to do so. Please join me in welcoming Anne to the lectern.
I have to button my jacket, even though it's very warm, because it helps the microphone. And then I'm all set. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on such a warm evening. I'd like to thank Hilary Shelton, the CEO, and Trevor Robertson, the President of ASHPA Victoria, for inviting me to present the lecture this evening. It's a great honour for me to be here. And I'd also like to thank Melbourne Graduate School of Education for hosting the event as part of the Dean's Lecture series. And I'm also pleased to welcome some of the Duras family who've been able to join us this evening. And I hope it will be a fitting occasion to remember Dr. Duras' significant contribution to physical education. I'm going to talk this evening about race, racism and whiteness, and interrogate what a critical whiteness lens might offer to our anti-racist practice in phys ed. The imperative to address issues of diversity, inclusion and race discrimination in education has arguably never been greater, given global mass migration, the increasing diversity of our classrooms, and the rise of nationalism, all in a climate marked by the mobilisation of fear around the stranger and increasing levels of xenophobia and Islamophobia. So in reading around Dr. Duras' biography, it's clear that these are not only contemporary concerns for us, but were very much part of his personal and professional experiences, at least in his early life in Germany. So we've heard in 1933, as a German medical doctor of Jewish heritage, he was forced to resign from his position in the Institute of Sports Medicine at the University of Friedenberg and start a journey that would eventually lead him to Australia to build a new life and build physical education here at the University of Melbourne and elsewhere in Australia, as we've heard. He was to offer the first and what was for many years the only university course in physical education training in Australia. The curriculum at the time probably revolved around history, principles and methods of physical education, and the science of physical education. And it's probably safe to say that social science knowledge, including considerations of the role of schooling in the reproduction of social inequalities, wouldn't have been a major feature of that curriculum, if it appeared at all. But of course, the Melbourne course wouldn't have been unique in this regard. At the time, most physical education courses were dominated by the bio-behavioural sciences. Indeed, we might question how much has changed in this regard when we look at contemporary practice. So although education and schooling have long been identified as important contexts for challenging racism, physical education as a specific subject area has rarely been central to such debates or practice. Nevertheless, given its close links with sport, physical education is a subject saturated by relations of gender, class and race. Sport as an embodied practice has long been central to the creation and maintenance of racial categories. Particular bodies are validated, others denigrated. So my colleague Ben Carrington, for example, has examined the creation of the category of the black athlete and its effects. Laura Arrozito has shown how the construction of ideal female athlete is one that is white, heterosexual and ideally pretty. Others have identified how the biological racism central to colonial times continues to underpin minority ethnic groups' experiences of sport or appear as scientific facts in textbooks used in universities and schools. And although arguably a sustained analysis is still required, existing research points to the ways in which racialised discourses are also upheld within physical education. I'm just going to take a glass. So is then a call for anti-racist practice in physical education really something of a lost cause, particularly given as practitioners and scholars we're an overwhelmingly white group, not renowned for our critical reflection on equity issues in general, never mind specifically about race. On the contrary, I want to argue this evening that it's precisely because of these characteristics that we need a critical engagement in race in physical education, and that it's timely to consider the role of critical whiteness studies in that endeavour. So first, I will highlight some of the key dimensions of critical whiteness as a theoretical perspective on race and explore why it might be useful to us, but also point out some of the challenges associated with it. And then I want to draw on some recently completed research, as the Dean suggested, funded by the British Academy, that Fiona Dowling and I conducted with white physical educators. And in concluding, I'll return to what a focus on whiteness might have to offer our practice in physical education. I'd like to start by suggesting that it's only relatively recently that I've become white. Let me qualify that. It's only relatively recently that I've become aware of being white, being conscious of being white. And as I'll go on to explore, this is how whiteness as a racial ideology and a system of privilege works. It works through being invisible to most whites for most of the time. So this means for those of us that are white, we don't have to think about race or of ourselves as racialised for most of the time. Race is something that refers to others, not to us. Hegemonic beliefs and practices about race tend to position whites as normal and as racially unmarked, and others as deficit and named. And this kind of thinking is probably a fair reflection on where we are in HPE in relation to addressing issues of race and racism. We've tended to work with our student teachers or conduct research in ways that seek to examine the effects of racism on racialised others. And although useful, this is a perspective that may inadvertently contribute to deficit views of racialised students in relation to an accepted white norm. And importantly, it positions us as white educators and our practices outside debates about race. So this is the dominant storyline of race, what Anne Flintoff has termed the normalised absence or pathologicalised presence discourse. That is, racialised others are either ignored altogether in policy discourse or viewed through a deficit lens as lacking in relation to a white norm. So, for example, we know more about Muslim girls or Indigenous Australian young people's experiences of HPE. I'm thinking about, for example, Kelly Nez's work, Alison Nelson's work here in Australia, for example, or about the gap in physical activity levels of young people from minority ethnic backgrounds in relation to their white peers, than we do about our everyday pedagogical practices and how these can work to reproduce racial stereotypes or inequalities. It's important to stress that I'm not arguing that race mapping patterns of inequalities across educational outcomes, or that seek to make visible the voices and experiences of racialised others, is neither valuable nor useful, far from it. And there are some excellent examples of such work in physical education. that both seek to document and make sense of racial inequalities, but also acknowledge the epistemological challenges of undertaking such research. But what I am suggesting is that we might consider turning our analytical lens and attention away from the so-called inadequacies of others, away from the race relations between us and them, towards an analysis of whiteness as a system of privilege. I'm using critical whiteness here as a shorthand term to encompass a broad umbrella of ideas and perspectives, including those that draw on critical race theory, black feminism, and post-colonial studies. A central tenet of these approaches is that racism is seen as more than the actions of a few abhorrent individuals. As David Gilbourne notes, the term racism is used not only in relation to crude, obvious acts of race hatred, but also in relation to the more subtle and hidden operations of power that have the effect of disadvantaging one or more minority ethnic groups. Excuse me. So adopting a critical whiteness lens in physical education would position us as white educators firmly inside of race, centralising white curricula and our pedagogies and practices within the processes of racialisation. So might then a critical whiteness perspective as one approach to anti-racist practice be helpful in working towards racial justice in HPE and schooling more broadly? I should add a note here about language, because race talk, how we talk about race, or indeed how we don't talk about race, is part of the ways in which whiteness works to construct difference and inequalities. The use of racial categories to describe groups of people is contentious, not least for the ways in which they can work to reify what could be viewed, or what should be viewed, as social difference. So I've drawn on the work of Cynthia Levine-Rasky and her use of the term racialised others tonight, because it ensures a link between racialisation and racism, reinforcing the point that race is best conceived as socially constructed rather than the attributes of individuals or groups of people. Having said that, one of its limitations is that it risks generalising that social inequality is socially attributable to race. There are other tensions that arise from a critical engagement in whiteness. It's beset with challenges, not least, as Nicola Rollock argues, white researchers, and I would add teachers, are not neutral inquirers in conversations about race. And certainly the irony of me being invited to talk about race and white privilege here tonight as a white academic from the UK, a country centrally implicated in Australia's colonial history, hasn't escaped me. Working with whiteness, as Levine-Rasky argues, will always be in tension, since we're always going to be working through whiteness. We're always going to be struggling against the very inequities that whiteness arranges. Our work will always be constructed through the epistemological frame of whiteness. Second, there is a risk that we slip into simply centralising white people rather than examining the social effects and processes of whiteness. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And a third challenge in the study of whiteness is to avoid seeing it as a static, unchanging entity. Instead, whiteness must always be seen as fractured. Racialised positions are always gendered and located within specific historical, cultural, and class-based realities. But despite these tensions and challenges, I'm in agreement with others that argue that the practices of whiteness can be disrupted and challenged if we work to analyse its workings, its effects, and its fractures. Whiteness has been conceptualised in many ways, but Frankenberg's tripartite model, developed from her 1993 study of white women's lives in America, remains a useful one, I think. She argues that whiteness is a standpoint from which white people look at ourselves, at others and society, a structural location of advantage, of race privilege, and a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. Whiteness as a standpoint points to how it's materially and discursively constructed, and importantly is historically contingent and culturally specific. Whilst race structures everyday experiences, we're all located within sets of discourses that have their roots in particular historical practices. Whiteness as a standpoint enables whites to avoid definition, since they're the norm in relation to which others are defined. My own and colleagues' research on race and physical education, conducted a few years ago, might serve as an example here. So it was a study that examined black and minority ethnic students' experiences of their PE teacher education. And it was funded as part of the English government strategy at the time to try and increase the diversity of those choosing to become teachers. So there were so few BME students in our PE programmes nationally at the time that it was considered useful to find out more about their experiences in order to inform our universities' widening participation strategies. So the graph on the right-hand side shows the persistent under-recruitment of BME students into PEAT in England over the 5 years prior to the study that took place in 2008. Physical education as a specific teacher education area is particularly white. So something like 11% of BME students opt into other areas to become teachers, maths, English and so on. In physical education, I think those little pink areas on the graph there represent about 2.7%, something like 70 students a year. And actually, if I updated the graph to today, it would show very little difference. The whiteness of PEAT seemingly remains persistently white as a specific subject area. Now, Louisa Webb and I have since reflected on the study and the extent to which our focus on BME students' experiences actually worked to construct rather than challenge ethnic and racial difference. So we didn't include white students in our study, just BME students. So in focusing on how well they fitted into our PEAT, we nicely avoided scrutiny of our own practices and their role in constructing or challenging racial differences and inequalities. We sidestepped how white student teachers and ourselves are also racialised. And John Gabriel refers to this discursive technique of whiteness as ex-nomination, the power not to be named, to avoid seeing ourselves as racialised. So the study's starting point was that our knowledge, our PEAT practices were the norm by which we researched and judged BME others. Whilst I wasn't surprised to learn that some of the students had experienced what they described as chilly climates or racial prejudice on their teaching placements, I was shocked to hear a colleague's response to the report's findings, which was to question whether the students were telling the truth. Such a response reflects the ways in which the privilege and luxury of whiteness involves the option of those of us that are white to either confront race, avoid it, or, as in this case, deny it. Whereas for racialised others, awareness of race is an everyday necessity. So Ruth Frankenberg's second dimension of whiteness, that it's also a structural location of advantage, of race privilege. So it's important that not all whites are positioned within and by whiteness in the same way, not least because we've seen whiteness is always co-constructed in relation to other relations of power such as class or gender. But nevertheless, a critical whiteness lens points to the ways in which racism is not just a network of structures that marginalised, racialised others, but one that results in sets of social advantages, economic, political, social, and so on, for whites at the expense of racialised groups. And at the same time, whiteness works so that this structural advantage is difficult for whites to see or acknowledge. So, for example, research documenting the outcomes of anti-racist sessions with student teachers that do focus on the racialised other point to hostility, guilt, or a sense of helplessness on the part of most white participants. Many white students confronted with issues of race in this way adopt a colourblind approach. They claim not to see race, to treat every child as the same, regardless of ethnicity or sex, and so on. And this colourblind approach, drawing on liberal notions of meritocracy and equal treatment, everybody can do well, they just have to put in the effort, is the dominant discourse of race in schools and what might be called the polite language of race. And with it comes a refusal to see or acknowledge the structural inequalities of race. Race gets defined as an individual problem, with the result that even talking about race is difficult because nobody wants to be found to be racist. Vinnie Lander, an English colleague in teacher education, argues that teacher education courses underpinned by such colour-blind approaches are at best ineffectual in challenging racism and at worst contribute to its reproduction. And so a growing number of teacher educators, at least in Europe and in North America, are now arguing for the use of a critical whiteness perspective as one way to support students to go beyond such colour-blind positions for addressing racial justice. However, they do point to the significance of our own role in the process. So as white teacher educators, we're also part of the parade. We're part of the processes by which our student teachers become committed or not to social justice. So without a critical reflection on how whiteness impacts on our own identities and positions as teacher educators, we can hardly expect our own student teachers to do the same. Finally, the third dimension of whiteness that Frankenberg identifies is whiteness is a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked and unnamed. White culture is seen as neutral, unmarked and invisible in relation to so-called others, exotic, different or dangerous cultures. Viewing whiteness as practice, then, allows us to question not who is white, but how is whiteness done? Whiteness, then, like racism, is fundamentally relational. So by focusing on whiteness as socially constructed, rather than something essentially linked to white bodies, avenues for change are possible. So I want to turn now to examine some of the ways in which whiteness works in HPE, drawing on some of the findings from our British Academy study, which was a cross-national study examining PE in England and Norway. And the study had two parts, a discourse analysis of PE curriculum texts and a study with physical educators that used stories to examine their experiences of race, racism and whiteness. And the final part of the project was to construct a CPD resource for others to use in their practice. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Excuse me. So in the first part of the study, we examined the truths about race that were traceable in contemporary PE curricula texts. And like Stephen Ball, we see curricula as not simply objects, written texts expressing values and ideas about appropriate learning content, but as text saturated with discourses that do things to people. PE teachers' interpretations of the text lead to outcomes in the PE classroom. So we were interested in what kinds of movements, physical activities and embodiments were valued, whose bodies are revered, whose are scorned. By analysing policy as discourse, we examined the productions of truths and knowledges about race looking for the ways in which meaning and the use of prepositions and word create certain possibilities for thought and action. And importantly, as the last bullet point notes there, Ball also reminds us of the importance of attending to what is not said as well as what is said in any curriculum text. So our analysis revealed how whiteness is constructed in the PE curriculum through two discursive techniques. Firstly, through what John Gabriel has called universalism, the ways in which white experience and knowledge is taken to account for the experiences of everybody, denying the presence and impact of racism on the lives of racialised others. So one of the ways in which whiteness is constructed is the way in which both curricula centralise particular activities, traditional sports, and link these to national identity as a neutral, unnamed category. Both talk about the importance of introducing young people to the country's traditional sports as essential knowledge and the best that can be thought and said, and position alternative, we could say, non-white sports or activities from other cultures as other to those that are central to Englishness or Norwegianness. A really good example taken from a recent document in England about good practice in physical education urges state schools to learn from the best practice of our elite private schools. Competitive sport is part of a wider and established culture. The best state schools recognise the wider benefits of participation in competitive sport. The document takes for granted that it's this culture of competitive sports established in the Victorian era of the early elite private schools, boys' schools of England, and transported around the world as an extension of nationalism and the empire, is one that might be equally attractive and meaningful to all pupils today, including those from minoritised or immigrant backgrounds. We might ask, established culture for whom? Analysis of the particular kinds of competitive sports in the English curriculum highlight how racialised discourses, as we've mentioned, are always enmeshed with those of class, gender and ability. So it's the game of cricket, football, rugby, netball and hockey that appear as examples in the text, not kabaddi, choop ball or goalball. Other physical activities are positioned in relation to competitive national sports and described as from other cultures or alternative activities. So in Norway, students are encouraged to learn about dances from other cultures. In England, other physical activities. A second technique is that of naturalism, the ways in which race is defined in relation to others, so that white bodies and perspectives are seen as natural and the norm, against which racialised others are viewed and judged. So, for example, the text are smattered with the use of the term our, that work to construct rather than dispel difference. Our implies the opposite, their, us and them. One example from an English examination syllabus for PE reproduces a conception of race as a matter of individual need. So students are asked to consider how some cultures encourage a greater level of participation in physical activity than others. So as noted earlier, given that this so-called race gap research that maps ethnic difference is a dominant storyline of race, it's not difficult to see how this text opens up the possibilities for stereotypes of particular groups to be considered as groups at risk in deficit ways because of their culture or gender. And so these stereotypes get reproduced as official knowledge through exam syllabuses and taught to new generations of aspiring PE teachers as facts. Racism as a form of structural inequality that may impact individuals' abilities to be able to take up and engage in physical activity in the first place is knowledge that's overlooked and invisible in the texts. So I was interested to learn a little bit about the new health and physical education curriculum here in Australia, particularly to learn about the struggles in its construction from Doon MacDonald's Fritz Duras lecture that she gave a few years ago. And Doon describes in that lecture the development of the curriculum was one of gradualism rather than revolutionary change. Such were the challenges, she suggests, of trying to accommodate different stakeholders' views. So the final document and the values and the interests expressed within it, so she suggests, is inevitably a reflection of struggle, compromise and interpretation. So I was interested to see to what extent whiteness was evident in this text in comparison to the English and Norwegian ones used in our study. And I have to admit, after a rather cursory examination, it seems that there are significant differences in how issues of diversity, inclusion and race are addressed in the Australian texts. So, for example, in the identification of, sorry, I should have moved on, the identification of critical thinking and intercultural understanding as general capabilities. These don't appear anywhere in the English curriculum. Or how students are required to understand how investigating and challenging racism can influence individual and community health and well-being. And similarly, in the Victorian HPE, Aims and Rationale, teachers are asked to involve students in critical inquiry to explore issues of inclusiveness, power inequalities, taken for granted assumptions, diversity and social justice. These point to very different discourses about race and racialised others to those that we found in our study, not least the explicit recognition and naming of racism, for example. And importantly, they seem to emphasise a strength-based approach to difference and recognition that inequalities need to be understood at a community and not just an individual level. So these examples, I would suggest, serve to show how whiteness as a set of unnamed cultural practices might be fractured by particular curriculum constructions. In the Australian texts, diversity from a strength-based perspective is positioned as a resource for learning rather than the process by which some youngsters are othered and found wanting. So I was interested to read Sue Watman and her colleagues' recent study of Indigenous student teachers shifting the whiteness of knowledge when teaching about family histories. It's a good example of the way in which difference can be used as a resource for learning. Similarly, students can learn about the significance of racism and structural relations of power as part of a critical engagement in HPE. Discourses about race that are not evident within my own curriculum texts. Of course, whilst curriculum texts are important resources about race on which teachers can draw, at the same time, we know that they don't or they can't tell teachers what to do. Nevertheless, they do frame and narrow the possibilities for action. So in the second part of our study, we focused on how teachers made sense of race in their pedagogy, using storytelling as a collective biography methodology. And as researchers who were also teacher educators, we also took part in the process of writing, sharing, and analysing the narratives. So storytelling can show how our personal experiences of race are always inevitably linked to bigger societal stories that are socioeconomically and culturally situated. So in talking about race as white physical educators, we were interested in not so much our individual lives and experiences, but rather what our stories revealed about the social effects and processes of whiteness, as a first step to being able to dismantle them and ultimately work towards more inclusive anti-racist PETE. The narratives revealed just how ill-equipped we were to teach about race in PETE, a discourse that saturated the texts from the perspectives of lacking any formal education about race ourselves, of knowledge about anti-racist policies at national and institutional levels, and not least the technique of what McKinney calls supplanting whiteness. We struggle to talk about race about ourselves as racialised, and we slipped into talking about other social divisions such as gender or class, and in doing so denied the importance of whiteness. Analysing the truths in the narratives about our teacher education work showed how race was constructed in relation to others, leaving whiteness unmarked. We talked about one-off sessions where the focus was on minority ethnic participation or experiences, about a lack of knowledge or interest, as this educator suggests, about a fear of getting it wrong in the white space of the PE classroom, particularly if faced with the presence of visibly ethnic minority students. In reflecting upon possible explanations for why teacher educators in England and Norway construct race in these ways, our analyses underline the power and privilege attached to whiteness. So though, as participants, we identify ourselves as aspiring to engage in anti-racist pedagogy, the narratives revealed how discursive techniques of whiteness work within our everyday PE pedagogy, a pedagogy where we were able to ignore our own ethnicities and racialised selves, where white bodies and perspectives are taken as the norm, by which others are measured, and where white experiences and knowledge is taken to count for the experiences of everybody. So what might we conclude from all of this? Might an engagement in a critical whiteness perspective be a fruitful one for our work as physical educators? Despite the important tensions that inevitably accompany the work that I highlighted earlier, I'd suggest yes, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it brings white physical educators and students back into race. It helps question the dominant storyline of race that pathologizes racialized others. The lens by which we engage with questions of diversity and inclusion in HPE, the first part of my title for tonight's lecture, can also be turned around, so diversity can be seen as a resource for learning. Our understanding of inclusive practice can start with a questioning of inclusion into what, as well as a questioning of who is positioned and advantaged by the taken for granted practices of HPE. Whilst to some extent we've asked such questions of gender equality in PE, I'd suggest we've yet to take these up in relation to race equality. A focus on whiteness as practice points to avenues for action. So it can help move white students and teachers from a position of despair or hopelessness towards identifying actions that individuals can take to work against racism, however small those actions may be. So Fiona and I were very conscious that our critical engagement with whiteness didn't remain at the theoretical research level separate from practice. And as a result, the third part of our research was to develop a professional development resource for others to use with their students. So this was one of our first, admittedly small steps towards working to dismantle whiteness. A small step. But I'm reminded of the response of Stuart Hall, Britain's foremost black sociologist, when he was asked several decades ago about the efficacy of a small teaching resource to challenge the enormity of racism in schools. And his response was to suggest that racism is inside schools and outside schools, but we must struggle from where we are. So as physical educationalists, I suggest that we can and must struggle from where we are, and that drawing on the insights of critical whiteness studies as part of our critical praxis might be useful in that struggle. Thank you.